So the final chapter is a chapter that I have contributed to the book, and so I will explain a bit about that chapter to you. Um, so the chapter is called Inflections of Hope, and the purpose of this chapter was to hopefully leave us at the end of this book with a sense of there is hope. You know, it's not doom and gloom, but there's actually a path forward. There's hope, and I wanted to give us some evidence of points of hope. And so, what I introduced is that my observation in working with organizations over the last 10 years and watching and observing other organizations is that I do think there is an awakening amongst business leaders, and they're starting to understand and recognize that we need to look at our innovations more holistically and look at our purpose as a business more holistically. And I think there is an awakening, and it's starting small and growing and spreading. And I think there's this growing realization and awareness in business that our pursuit of growth and innovations in the name of that growth um, have to be done in a sustainable way and in a way that benefits stakeholders around the world. And so, what I've tried to do in this chapter is to present some evidence of those that awakening, that growing awakening. And so I point out four specific points and then one what I call inflection curve that I believe are really milestones and stakes in the ground that point that we're moving in the right direction. So I'll explain each one of those briefly. So the first inflection point happened back in 2006, and it was with the start of what's called the B Corp movement. And this was a small group of people that came together and said, we're going to create what's called a B Corp, and B stands for benefit. And the whole purpose and point of that was that these are organizations that stop and evaluate what they're doing to make sure it benefits all stakeholders. It's the concept called stakeholder capitalism. And so rather than simply benefiting shareholders and generating short-term profits, it's asking the question, how can everything we do in our business benefit all of the stakeholders, customers, employees, markets, the society at large, the environment? How can we benefit all of those in a sustainable way? And there's actually, since that time, there's been thousands of organizations globally that have signed on over the last 14 years to become B Corps, and some of the leading brands you would recognize too, like Patagonia that was mentioned. So the B Corp movement was really, I think, a major stake in the ground, or really first pivot point in this direction of saying we have to think broadly about stakeholder capitalism and organizations existing for all stakeholders. The second inflection point, I believe, happened in 2015 with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these were 17 new goals that were designed to replace their previous set of goals, which are called the Millennium Goals. And in going from the Millennium Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations leaders really sat down and put a lot of time into and thought into what are the areas we need to focus on, what are the realistic paths that we can move toward, and how can we get the entire world to come together under these specific goals and work toward them. And so coming out of that, they developed 17 specific sustainable development goals. And it's been my perception that these 17 sustainable development goals have had far more impact in the last 5 years than their efforts toward the Millennium Development Goals prior to that. So in the last 5 years, the Sustainable Development Goals have had tremendous impact around the world, and all of the signatory nations of the UN have signed on to it. And most of those nations now have their own version of Sustainable Development Goals that derive from the UN's SDGs, and they're pursuing that. So at the public sector and the government level, you see this tremendously with governments trying to really shape the future and move their organizations, move their nations toward positive progress along the line of these Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN was another major stake in the ground of moving the world in that direction. The third inflection point came the year after in 2016 with the Paris Climate Agreement. And most of the leading nations in the world have come together and signed on to this agreement. And its commitments, each nation has its own commitments, but it's commitments to taking certain positive actions to reduce carbon footprint and to reduce the environmental impact that their industrial and agricultural and mining and other operations have on the world. So the Paris Agreement has had tremendous adoption and a tremendous impact and influence on how governments and private sector are pursuing, the work they're doing to try to do so in a way that helps each nation meet specific environmental goals. So I think the Paris Agreement was a major inflection point as well. The fourth inflection point came in 2019 when the Business Roundtable issued a new statement. And for context, the Business Roundtable is a gathering of some of the world's largest CEOs of some of the largest organizations, Fortune 100 type organizations in the world. Organizations like IBM and General Motors and Ford and others. And these CEOs, and a lot of this was led by Jamie Dimon at Chase Bank, and was really vocal in this, but they came together and they said explicitly that the purpose of a business isn't simply to make profit for the shareholders, but it's to benefit all of the stakeholders that organization impacts and affects. So essentially, they were echoing in a certain way what the B Corp movement was saying. But now this, whereas the B Corp tended to be medium-sized enterprises, the Business Roundtable is now representing very, very large corporate enterprises globally. And so now you have this, I think, awakening, this realization by the large corporates that what B Corp was saying, 13 years prior is in fact true, that we go beyond, the philosophy that the primary purpose of a business is to make profit, but rather the purpose is to benefit all stakeholders around the world. And so Business Roundtable stepping forward and explicitly stating that in 2019, I think was yet another very major milestone and turning point for us. And then the last inflection curve that I mentioned, because it's more of a trend than a specific event, has to do with sustainable infrastructure financing. I spent a large part of 2019, working and consulting with the Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates, based in Dubai. And in a lot of that work, I saw this move toward sustainable financing of infrastructure. And I'm not an economist, so I can't elaborate the specific economic and financial details of each one, but I do know there are a number of new approaches like green bonds and other approaches to environmental investment and public-private partnerships, for example, for pursuing infrastructure in new sustainable ways. And this is important because particularly in developing parts of the world, the need and demand for infrastructure far outstrips the ability of governments to finance and fund that. And so the need is to turn to other sources of funding and financing to provide the level of infrastructure that's needed well beyond what they otherwise would have the resources to do. And so some of these new mechanisms of financing, like green bonds, for example, and green bonds have seen large organizations investing in them. Amazon, for example, is investing in green bonds to help finance some of the infrastructure development where needed. And it's done in a way that they recapture some of the value. So there is a positive return on investment. So what we're seeing a trend really toward more and more sustainable infrastructure financing. And I really think that is a major milestone too in pointing us in that direction. And so I wanted to, really leave us with evidence that there is this awakening and this growing realization, this trend that we have to pursue stakeholder capitalism in a very holistic way, and there are business in general around the world is now more and more waking up to that realization. And so our job is to take all the points of this book, purpose driven and innovating for the right reasons and purposes, and being careful in what we do, and take that movement forward and perpetuate it. I also show us in this chapter a list of organizations I'm aware of that are really joining in this cause and helping to move that forward. And there's quite a long list there. And there's undoubtedly probably hundreds more of organizations that are really, nonprofits and others that are really helping to move us in that direction. So I wanted to leave us with that sense of there is this awakening and we can continue to take that forward.